It was late on a Sunday, and my apartment felt emptier than usual. The living room lamps were off, and the only light came from the street lamp slicing a pale rectangle across my bedroom door. I had told everyone I was staying home alone to get work done, but at 2 in the morning I woke to the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps coming from inside my bedroom. At first I thought it was the cat, but I did not have a cat. I told myself I was dreaming, and then the doorknob twisted once, as if someone had tested it and moved on. I froze hard enough to hear my heart knocking against my ribs. I am the one telling this now because I was the person under that light and the one who smelled the stale breath of fear in that silent hallway. What I will tell you now is the full sequence, from the tiny sounds no one notices to the choice I made that night, because something about those footsteps kept following me for months. I grew up in a cramped duplex on Maple Street with my mom, Carla, and my dad, Raphael. As a kid, I learned to listen before I looked. My early memories are full of small alarms the house would give me at night. The pipes would sing, another night the porch boards would sigh. I left for college and lived in dorms and small rentals, and that habit of listening never left me. In my 20s, I moved back to care for my mother after she had surgery, and we settled into a quiet rhythm. I worked late as an editor, and my friends Mark and Jenna would crash on the couch when their shifts ended. Louis from the coffee shop stopped by every Sunday with leftover pastries. I named my neighborhood people the way some people collect spoons. Uncle Pete, who lived down the block, always kept an extra key. Mrs. Alvarez across the street baked empanadas and would holler if she heard a door slam at odd hours. That sense of community made the night the footsteps started feel larger than a private scare. I had a ritual before bed. Check the locks, set the kettle by the stove, text Mark the word locked so he knew I was safe. I never imagined those habits would be the map I would rely on to survive a nightmare. The first clear sign that something was wrong came 3 weeks after I moved back in. Night number 1 was just wind and sleep. Night number 2, I dismissed a thump as a tree branch. On the third night, I woke to a soft scrape along the hallway wall and a faint smell like wet cardboard right outside my door. I sat up and listened. The footsteps were not hurried. They were measured and slow, as if testing floorboards for weight. I reached for my phone, and it buzzed on the dresser. The screen casting a small blue square across the ceiling. I whispered, "Are you awake, Mark?" And the phone stayed quiet. I whispered again, "Jenna, are you up?" And finally, a one-word reply came from Mark, "I am," with a sleeping face emoji. It did not comfort me. I slid off the bed and felt the carpet cold under my feet. The handle turned twice. I remember thinking the hair on my arms had time to stand up and then lie down again. I said out loud, "Who is there?" And the only answer was the hollow echo of my own voice. I tried to be practical at first. I dialed 911 and kept the phone on speaker, voice low, telling the dispatcher the address and that I was home alone and that I heard footsteps. The dispatcher said a unit was nearby and told me to stay quiet and try to make a plan if whoever was there tried to get in. I whispered instructions to myself like a prayer. At the door, I pressed my ear to the wood and felt the vibration of someone breathing on the other side. Then the knob clicked, and someone pushed the door in with enough force that a strip of paint flaked off and floated like ash to the floor. I backed away, and my hands hit the dresser and knocked over a glass which exploded into cold starbursts on the carpet. The footsteps moved into the room and then stopped right in front of my closet. I could hear a zipper, a rustle of fabric, and the soft metallic scrape of a keyring against a floorboard. I said, "Stop," and it felt like saying a prayer into a mouthful of darkness. The voice that answered was a whisper, male and dry, saying, "I do not want to hurt you. Tell me where the cash is." That was the moment the fear became a calculation and not just noise. I remember 3 particular moments in that first invasion that stand out like holes cut in a blanket of memory. The first was the doorknob turning, followed by the zipper of a jacket sliding open in the closet. I felt every hair on my arms left. My throat closed, and I remembered my father teaching me to press against the door latch with the space between my hip and the wood until it would not budge. I crouched low and shoved everything I could behind the dresser. The floor smelled faintly of oil and nicotine. I held my breath until the sound of footsteps paused and then came back softer, as if the intruder had crouched and was dragging something. I counted silently to 45, then to 100, as if numbers could span the distance between me and whoever stood in my room. I could hear the dispatcher breathing on the line and the muffled radio from the hallway through the thin walls. The room felt like a throat narrowing with every second. I will give you the dialogue from the most intense moments because it shows how small decisions were made. I said, "Where are you?" in a voice I tried to keep steady. The intruder said, "Under the bed." I said, "No, you are not." He said, "I am tired." He reached with a hand and brushed the toe of my shoe. I said, "I am calling the cops." He said, "They are not fast enough." I said, "Get out." He laughed a little and said, "You do not know what I do for a living." My voice got louder. I said, "Get out now." And I heard a rustle like someone trying to be gentle with a sleeping animal. I said, "I have a dog." And he said, "I see that." On the couch, nothing moves. I told the dispatcher he is under the bed, and she said, "Stay on the line, keep calm, stay quiet." The cadence of those lines felt like trading places with danger. Each exchange was a thread I had to pull or let go. The police sirens came first as a distant rumor, and then as a raw trumpet at the edge of the street. When Officer Rivera and Officer Sims arrived, they moved in with a kind of slow certainty I had not expected. There was knocking at the front door, and a voice from the hallway saying, "Police, come out with your hands up." I heard a scuff and then a small, strangled noise, like someone pressing their face into a pillow. Officer Rivera spoke to me through the door asking, "Are you hurt?" And I said, "No, I am in the bedroom." He asked, "Is anyone else in the apartment with you?" And I said, "Only me and a couch full of sleeping bodies." He said, "Stay put, do not make any sound." The officers radioed back that they were going in, and I could hear boots on the stairs and the particular click of nightsticks against belts. They found him under the bed, curled up with a blanket pulled up to his chin and a rusty pocket knife on the mattress beside him. He looked less like a monster and more like a man who had given up. Officer Rivera handcuffed him and said, "You are going to the station." And the man said, "I did not mean to scare you." In that room full of shattered glass and the smell of fear, relief felt like something you had to earn slowly. The man was Reuben, a 53-year-old transient I had seen once in the alley near the laundromat. He did not resist and did not speak much, but the sight of him in cuffs made my knees feel liquid. The officers collected statements and took photographs, while I sat with my hands wrapped around a paper cup of tea a neighbor Jenna had brought when she heard sirens. I remember the way the officers handled evidence. They wore gloves and asked questions in a steady voice that made the chaos feel like a procedure. Officer Sims asked if there were prints on the knob, and Officer Rivera asked me to describe what I had heard and felt. I gave them small pieces: a scrape on the doorframe, a scent of old cigarettes, a muddy footprint on the welcome mat. I told them about Uncle Pete, who kept an extra key, and how he sometimes let himself into the house by mistake, and they asked to speak to him. Mark and Louis and Jenna came down from the couch, pale-eyed with coffee breath, and hugged me until I could breathe again. Mrs. Alvarez stood on the stoop with her arms crossed and a bag of empanadas, and at some point I heard her tell Officer Rivera, "We saw a man on the porch last week. He was looking at the windows like a cat." Names were attached to actions, and suddenly the story had a larger frame. The man from under my bed was arrested and charged with trespassing and possession of burglary tools. The station number was scribbled on a slip of paper that I kept in my wallet like a talisman. The days after were strange. I changed locks, installed a chain, and set up a chief camera in the hallway. I slept with all the lights on for a week, and then with a small lamp until I could be alone in the dark again. Numbers of calls to the police were filed, statements were signed, and the case moved to the detective unit. Detective Kim took my statement and asked routine questions about missing items and previous disturbances. She was precise and professional and spoke of patterns and possible motives. I gave her the names of people who had keys. I gave her Uncle Pete, and she wrote it down. The awkwardness of telling a stranger that someone had slept under my bed was balanced by the relief of being heard and recorded. My hands shook when I signed the forms, but my voice did not. I received a notification the man had been held for a psychiatric evaluation and later charged. Legal processes have a way of turning fear into boxes to check. That did not fix the nights that followed. If you are sitting through this and already feeling queasy, write yes in the comments and tell me if you have ever heard someone walk inside your house when you were asleep. Your comment matters more than you think because these stories teach one another. When I put that post on social media, Mark wrote, "You are not alone," and Jenna messaged, "Come stay with us." The neighbors checked in. People remarked it could have been worse, and some insisted that I overreacted. I know now reactions vary, but the moment we go from silence to a shared note of alarm is the point where safety networks start to breathe. Months passed and other incidents trickled in like rain through a cracked gutter. On a Thanksgiving, a shadow at the cabin window made me run through wet leaves until the deputies in flashing lights blocked the single lane and asked me to calm down. On another night, a set of footprints led from my back porch to the alley and stopped at the fence as if the person had decided against leaving. I will give you 3 moments of tension that kept repeating in my head and changed the way I moved through rooms. The first was the footsteps from inside my own bedroom. I can still feel the way the wood warmed under my palm when I braced my shoulder against the door. The intruder had a small tremble in his breathing, like someone trying not to cry. I pressed my hand to the lock and imagined the numbers of the police arriving. The quiet was so deep it sounded like a held breath. Counting seemed to keep me anchored. I told myself to listen to the floor, to the pipes, to the radio outside. It was a waiting, scaled up with dread and strange determination. The second was when I found evidence that someone had been living in the crawl space below my house. It was a smell of old food and socks and the way the dust lay in patterns as if a sleeping spot had been used. I crawled in with a flashlight and found a small pile of worn clothing, a dented thermos, and a scrap of a local paper with a date 3 weeks earlier. My fingers brushed a coin and my stomach rolled. The idea that someone could be physically inside the structures we claim as ours made my skin crawl, as if I had been touched. The crawl space had been a place I never checked, but suddenly it was the first place I looked when I came home. The third was the shadow at the cabin window 2 months later. I woke to the noise of a twig breaking and a shallow breath against the glass, like a seal. I held the lantern up and the shadow slid away, but the smell of smoke lingered, as if someone had stood there with a cigarette. I ran into the trees without shoes and did not stop until the lights of a patrol car lit the trunks like thin columns. The idea that silhouettes can be waiting at the edge of your living room like a recollection you cannot shake was terrifying and made me sleep with the door open and the key in my hand for weeks. Names kept coming up as actors in these nights. Mark brought coffee and an extra blanket. Jenna sat with me while the police took statements. Lewis fished a wallet I had dropped when I ran. Officer Rivera and Officer Sims filed reports and told me to make sure my locks were replaced. Detective Kim called with updates. Mrs. Alvarez kept an eye on the porch and waved me inside like a lighthouse. Uncle Pete apologized for leaving his key under a welcome mat and replaced it with a magnetic keypad. Ruby the dog next door barked at the slightest shadow and once scared away a man I thought might be watching the back fence. Each of these people did something concrete, and those actions kept me anchored when the stories could have swallowed me whole. There was a second major break in the pattern when a neighbor named Sam, whose rent I helped cover for a month, reported his own break-in. He called me shaking and said, "Someone came through my window while I was sleeping," and his voice was raw like the night was still inside him. I drove over in 5 minutes and saw the glass and the mud and the faint smear of a hand on his countertop. We sat for an hour and made lists of the small changes we could do, lighting, trimming the hedges, an alarm system, a community watch. The police suggested cameras, and so did Detective Kim. We formed a group chat and we named it Watchful Eyes. In that chat, Officer Rivera dropped a link to low-cost cameras, and Jenna bought a sensor light and asked Mark to set it up. The community started to act like a skin around the houses, and it made a difference, sometimes small, sometimes critical. The final flashpoint came on a rainy Thursday when I was alone at the cabin and heard a slow knock against the bedroom window and the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the porch overhead. I grabbed the keys and the little flashlight and moved toward the back door. I called 911 as I stepped into the slick night. I could hear someone moving along the side of the house toward the front, and the light from the main road painted wet reflections on the leaves. I shouted, "Police are coming!" And the person on the porch whispered something that sounded like a name my grandmother would use. I did not wait to argue. I ran into the woods and over a ditch and through brambles until the patrol car stopped and the beam sliced the darkness. Officer Sims shone a light on a figure huddled by the porch, and I saw the outline of someone small and thin and afraid more than dangerous. He said, "I did not mean to scare you," and I answered, "Then do not come near people who are sleeping." The police took him away to a hospital for evaluation. That night, I stayed in the back of the cruiser with the heater on while they wrote statements and took photos, and I understood that fear makes you move like a hunted animal. You end up carrying a list of what you will never do again in your head. The legal aftermath stretched into months. The man from my apartment was held and later released on bail due to a procedural error, and I remember the stomach-sinking panic when I learned that. Detective Kim explained the limits of the system and helped me apply for a restraining order. The man from the crawlspace was given mental health services and later relocated to a shelter after the shelter system found a bed for him. The cabin intruder was committed for evaluation. The records have names and dates and a lot of bureaucratic language that makes violent intrusion into a medical or legal problem and not an intimate violation. A month after the first incident, I had replaced all the locks and put up motion lights. 3 months later, I moved to a different neighborhood 2 towns over and kept a cheap camera always pointed at my bedroom door. 6 months later, I joined a neighborhood coalition and started a small series of meetings with Officer Rivera and Detective Kim to understand preventative steps individuals can take and how to support people in crisis without exposing themselves to danger. The arc moved from being a single terrified person to being part of a small network of people who watched out for one another. I still wake sometimes with the impression of a footstep in the hall, and I have to tell myself it was the pipes or the cat I never had. The memory of the zipper in the closet and the scraping of a knife across wood is sharp in my palms. What changed is less dramatic than moving houses. It is more a set of habits. I never leave doors unlocked even for a minute. I keep a phone in my hand at night. I asked Mark, Jenna, and Louis to have an emergency plan with me on standby. I learned to listen for patterns and not dismiss them. I learned to ask for help immediately and to accept that the system is imperfect but can still be useful. I also learned to sit with fear without letting it rewrite my life into something unrecognizable. If there is one practical piece of advice, take this. If you hear footsteps inside your house and you are alone, do not confront immediately. Call the police and try to get to a secure place. Make noise if you can do so safely to indicate people are awake. Get to a room with an exit or a phone. Tell someone you trust and keep them on the line if you can. After the immediate danger is gone, document everything and speak to authorities and neighbors. Do not feel silly for installing simple safety measures. Sometimes the small things, the camera, the chicken light, the extra lock, are the fences that keep fear from becoming harm. If this story made you uneasy and you have your own experience, write yes in the comments and tell us briefly what happened and where. If you have not been through anything like this, write no and tell us what you would do. Your comments create the map that helps others notice the small signals before the larger ones arrive. If you want more stories and practical tips, hit subscribe. I tell these stories because mine is not unique, and sharing the sequence of small decisions might help you make the right choice if you ever hear footsteps coming from your bedroom. Remember the final line that kept me moving forward. The house was entered, but not my life. I still choose to live my days with light and friends and locked doors.